Is grief mental illness? This is such a loaded topic and such a current controversy. A new grief diagnosis has been established, and I am having a really strong reaction to it. So, today, hear my rant out and let's ponder if grief is a mental illness. I'm Joe McRogers. I'm a grief therapist who supports grief through this YouTube channel and my private therapy practice. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is now in its 5th edition. It's called the DSM for short. This is a reference handbook published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it gathers input and expertise of more than 160 mental health clinicians and researchers from all over the world. And it is a tool and reference guide for mental health clinicians to diagnose, classify, and identify mental illness. The first edition of the DSM in 1952 held no reference to grief at all. The third edition held some space for grief as it identified that a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder could not be made until a full year after a loss. This recognized that normal and common reactions to the death of a loved one could mimic or look like symptoms of a major depressive disorder. For example, things like sadness, disturbed sleep, lack of concentration, and changes in eating, and loss of interest in things that were once pleasurable. In 1994, the 4th version of the DSM reduced the bereavement time to 2 months. 2 months after a loss, meaning that anyone experiencing the symptoms of sadness, sleep, and eating disturbances, loss of pleasure in things that were once pleasurable, could then receive a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder 2 months after the death of a child, after the death of a parent or a spouse. How does this even begin to make sense? Recently published, the DSM-5 is now listing a new mental health diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder. The diagnostic criteria for this mental illness is it can only be diagnosed no sooner than 1 year after the death of a loved one. It is defined as a daily, intense longing for the deceased, a preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased. Additional symptoms, 3 of which are needed for a diagnosis: identity confusion, disbelief, avoidance of reminders of the loss, intense emotional pain, difficulty engaging with others and with life, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness. Tell me, which one of you would not have met these criteria at the 1-year mark? Does this surprise you that this is now a medical diagnosis of a mental illness? Am I so far down the grief rabbit hole that I'm the only one bristling with this? Please put your thoughts and comments below. We all need to learn together. Our society moves in a hurried way that uses big metrics. Clean out the house, get pregnant again, you already have other children, start dating, get back to work. I know that grief resides beyond these types of measurements. Grief is tender, it's sacred, it can be spiritual, it can be generational, and it's always raw. How can we place time limit on appropriate grief? How does this serve us in a diagnosis? Undoubtedly, I have seen people have their lives hijacked by their grief, the enormity of their loss, the enormity of their grief, their ability to even begin to imagine that some happiness could come their way in the future. There can be risk of self-harm, suicide, depression, addictions, other high-risk behaviors, and each of these need to be evaluated. Medications, hospitalizations, rehab, sobriety may all need to be considered, but the primary question needs to be, how is their grief being supported? My theory has always been that unsupported grief risks becoming life-limiting trauma. I could somewhat support the quest for a diagnosis if the outcome was increased access to support and resources that are specialized in grief. If it provided a code for insurance through a diagnosis that then granted grief support, grief therapy of all types. It's so ironic that this diagnosis lands in a world of the pandemic. Pandemic times have brought about so much grief, and at a time when the pandemic has eclipsed our grief, it has taken away our rituals, our gatherings, our comfort measures. And here we are, pathologizing a very human reaction to loss. Perhaps as a society, it is easier to pathologize grief than it is to attend to it, and that statement makes me saddest of all. How many will attend their doctor's office because they are not eating or sleeping, because they're having trouble concentrating, because they're having difficulty relating to the rest of the world, and they are experiencing run-on intrusive thoughts, and they have just passed the 1-year anniversary of their loved one's death? They will meet the criteria for this diagnosis. Will it bring them free and varied supports? Will it bring them more protected time and money in order to be off of work? Prolonged grief disorder is defined by a daily intense yearning for the deceased or a preoccupation with thoughts or memories of them. Yep. Additional symptoms, again, 3 of which are required for the diagnosis. Identity confusion. Who am I now? Disbelief. How can this be real? Avoidance of reminders of the loss and emotional numbness. Yep, we're going to protect our brains. Emotional pain, which is grief. Difficulty engaging with others and with life. That's isolation. Feeling different from others. Feeling that life is meaningless. Yep, where is hope? And intense loneliness. Well, yes, because no one else can know your grief. This all ends in mental illness diagnosis. Too often the trip to a medical appointment will result in a diagnosis and a medication, full stop. No mention of grief support being essential. It is reported in the Washington Post, and I've included several links in the comments below, that the most important goals of complicated grief are to develop a narrative of what happened, to revise and recreate one's relationship with the loved one who has now died, and to reinvent oneself. They suggest that after loss, we need to reconstruct life meaning and find a way to reinvest in living. Well, yes. Yes, this is the work of grief. I do this daily with the good people who come to me in my grief therapy. This doesn't need a diagnosis. Now, I know I'm a grief snob, but it seems so contrary to healing to medicalize a societal failure. This diagnosis suggests that grievers are doing a poor job, instead of suggesting that society is unable to stand the sadness and grief of others. How is the parent who lost a child supposed to feel at the 1-year mark? How are the loved ones of a violent death supposed to get on with life at the 1-year mark? How is the person who lost their everything not expected to yearn for them and wonder if life is worthwhile on a daily basis? Do you know what prolongs grief? Isolation, not being able to grieve as each individual needs, and being rushed through it. The opposite of grief is connection. Connection with one's self, connection with the loved one who died, and connection with the living relationships as who you are now. How does a mental health diagnosis facilitate connection? There are so many healers that can hold space for grief in a real and vital way. A diagnosis without changing how we approach grief doesn't help anyone. Okay, rant over. What are your thoughts? Where have I got it wrong? Can you see value in a mental illness diagnosis that I am just blind to? Please put your thoughts below in the comments section. The DSM has made several changes throughout the years. In its first edition in 1952, it included homosexuality as a sexual deviant diagnosis. And it wasn't until 1974 that the American Psychiatric Association removed that diagnosis of homosexuality. That was progress. I really do fear, though, that this new diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder is not progress. In your experiences and reflections of grief, I send to you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. Please, if this video has been helpful, please share it, like it, and let YouTube know that grief needs a voice. Thank you. Take care.